So you talked about previous prisoner exchanges as well. Could we get a little more on that? How did that turn out to go? The previous prisoner exchanges, or the deals, or the times that they got to talk about it but couldn't land it.
Well, the prisoner exchange thing is something that Israel had ever since its inception as an entity. And it happened with multiple sides and countries, like Egypt, like other countries too. If we go to more recent history, since the 80s, it has proven to be an effective means to release prisoners in Israeli prisons. In Lebanon, there were multiple actions where Israelis were taken and many Palestinians were released. One of them was the very famous Jibril uh, prisoner exchange. So, in return for approximately four Israelis, several thousand Palestinians were released, including big names. Hezbollah and Hamas both kidnapped uh, prisoners of war. Well, the Hezbollah ones, well, they killed them and kidnapped them, but Israel didn't know. They kept it such a high secret that Israel didn't know up until they were actually released. Then they released their prisoners after 2006. In 2006, the Palestinians kidnapped Gilad Shalit, and for one, they released 1,000 and approximately 49 prisoners, one of which was none other than the martyr Yahya Sinwar, who later became the leader of Hamas. Israel, with time, started to view the prisoners that are taken as a liability. So they started to intensify the Hannibal Directive, and they started to implement the Hannibal Directive in more clearly, at least because it's been existing there for a very long time, despite official denial, by the way. In 2014, when the Palestinian resistance took Oron Shaul as a prisoner, Israel shot him and the group that imprisoned him. The Palestinians did not say whether he was dead or not. Israel declared him dead in a foreign land, and they had this burial for him without his body to conclude the situation. They also had several other prisoners of war, the Palestinian side, but Israel kept on delaying anything to do with the deal because they did not want to pay the price for prisoners remaining in Gaza. However, now it was, of course, a much bigger thing because the Palestinians kidnapped more than 250 people. Mostly, of course, now the only ones remaining are IDF soldiers, by the way, from the Gaza division. So Israel had to give in, and they already gave in with very big names, and some of them are the longest serving prisoners. For example, like Nail al-Barghouthi, who served approximately just over 40 years in total. He was released and later imprisoned and what have you, which proved that Israel is willing to pay the price. Now, with the recent move where Netanyahu started to escalate further and they started to kind of declare that they're not interested in these prisoners of war, although their propaganda campaign was saying, oh, bring them back, and clearly they had a different plan because the Palestinian side was willing to end everything from the beginning by having a direct exchange. Hamas told Israel after Al-Aqsa flood, release our prisoners, we'll release all of them. We're happy to do that tomorrow. Israel, of course, had a different plan, the ethnic cleansing, the genocide, displacement, all of which were buried, by the way. Now, the agreement clearly states the Gazans will remain in their place. We already saw Palestinians going back to the north. That's it. So now they're still trying to insist on certain names because, from an Israeli perspective, they view them as very heavily influential. For example, Marwan al-Barghouthi will be reviving the Fatah movement with more nationalism after this treacherous action coming from the PLO for the past 3 decades, and selling out all of these rights of the Palestinian people, more settlements, no action, going against the resistance. So he will revive that nationalist movement. Ahmad Saadat is the leader of the PFLP. The PFLP is one of the fiercest non-religious, if you might say, resistance movements and political movements, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, who also view the need to liberate all of Palestine from the river to the sea, but they want a secular state rather than a Muslim influenced state like Hamas do in general. So, and then of course leaders in the Al-Qassam brigades like Marwan Abdullah al-Barghouthi and others as well. Very heavily influential and charismatic figures who can make a difference. And the last thing that Israel wants, in their view, is to have another person who will have the same effect as Yahya Sinwar. You know, being released from prison and all of a sudden leading a movement that will prepare something much bigger against them. So from that point of view, that could be one of the things that will harm the continuation, depending on how the Palestinian side takes it. Mm? Do they persist? Do they convince the mediators to persist and apply pressure, both on the American side and the Israeli side? Or do they compromise and say, well, listen, we're going to have to reach a deal and end the genocide, and we're going to have to keep that case open for future negotiations, for example, rather than risking the whole deal over 5 names, if that makes sense. Which, by the way, is something if you ask the prisoners themselves, like the longest serving prisoner, Nail al-Barghouthi, after he was released, he said, you know, from my perspective, I don't view this as like people had to be killed for my release. Do you understand? So they understand that perspective, the cost per what's happening. So there might be many calculations here. Again, assuming that that's going to prevent Israel from doing anything else under any pretext. Because the problematic elements, by the way, can allow Israel to restart the war somehow, either by the excuse of, well, Hamas hasn't disarmed, or there's still missiles here, or even them with some of the militias that they created in Gaza, conducting an operation, blaming it on their resistance, and saying that's another excuse to get back to the genocide. But all of that has to be factored in with Israel's international position, because Israel's international position has been deteriorating so heavily in the past 2 years. They've become a pariah state, isolated, everyone hates them, and they're viewed as illegitimate. There's more pressure globally on governments to stop their corruption and continued complicity with this genocide and stop supporting them, as a matter of fact, boycott them and remove them from the United Nations, de-recognize them, if you will, simultaneously with the recognition of a Palestinian state. A lot of that, of course, will depend on Benjamin Netanyahu and how far he goes ahead with this coalition deal, because technically he passed this agreement. Two of his key allies in his government, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, voted against, alongside at least 3 or 4 others, but they didn't take that as an excuse to withdraw from the government, which is important, because that means, okay, we're not agreeing on it, but we're remaining in the government. How long can Benjamin Netanyahu buy them or convince them with that? That's also a different story. So we have quite a sensitive situation that is very volatile, and it would be no surprise if Netanyahu crashes this agreement at some point.
You mentioned something about Hannibal plan. If you get more on that.
Yeah, Hannibal Directive, for those who are not aware about the Hannibal Directive, it's a policy where Israel kills its own people or its own soldiers so that they don't pay political price for them being imprisoned. And that's a known directive. Everyone in the Israeli army knows that. After a lot of scrutiny and criticism internally within Israel, Legally, it shouldn't be there. However, the Israeli state doesn't abide by its own laws, by the way. And the Israeli army always has a different type of approach to counter these measures. So we saw Israel killing its own soldiers multiple times during this genocide. First and foremost, the biggest Hannibal Directive in case of mass killing Israel is what was on the 7th of October. They killed Israeli soldiers, they killed Israeli civilians, they killed people in the Nova Festival to increase the number of casualties, to make it out as if it's a bigger event. Evidence on the ground proved that. People who were witnesses said that on live television, and then they started to restrict them. There was one Israeli pilot who spoke with Israelis in Kibbutz Nir Oz, who said we had an order at the time also to shoot at everything going to the direction of Gaza, regardless of their identity. And there were also helicopter images shown for Israel to shoot everything going back to Gaza, knowing very well that some of them could have been Israelis being captured to the Gaza Strip. Then, of course, some of the prisoners of war were released, and they started to speak about how they were targeted 3 times on their way to Gaza. So Israel knew that they were on the way back, and they were targeting them, so they wouldn't be prisoners of war. One of them was released on humanitarian reasons. Her name is Yocheved Lifshitz, alongside another woman. And then she had a press conference. At the time, Israel said it was like a bombshell on their PR, and they tried to manipulate it as usual. So Israel does that regularly, and we saw by Israel's actions how they targeted their prisoners of war many times, so they can tell the people they killed them. In one instance, there was an Israeli soldier being captured by the resistance. Somehow Israel found his location, and they knew, and they actually made a statement that if we have a figure wanted in a tunnel and one of our prisoners of war is there with him, then we need to make a hard decision. And they landed bombs that later had released gases. Israel does that, releases bombs, and then they release gases as a secondary measure of the explosion, by the way. But Israel knows that. And they killed their own prisoner of war. And after he was tested, after they had this testing in Israel, they found out that he actually died because of gas, the same gas that was due to the Israeli missile. And his mother at the time, she went to his grave in Israel and wrote on it, our government killed you, our security forces killed you. And she was banned by, they removed her, statements from his grave, the Israeli security forces, because they didn't want this to be a big deal. However, it was known in Israeli social media, it was reported heavily. There were other instances where, for example, what's her name, Noa Argamani, who was a prisoner of war, was released. When she was released, she said that Israel had carried out a strike on the building I was in, and I almost died. She was full of thingy, and others died in that incident, where Israel released 3 but had 4 Israelis killed. So all of these things prove to you that Israel viewed them as a burden and wanted to get rid of them. And that also explains the decision of the Palestinian side to have an agreement now, not without, of course, certain things being met on the ground, which were the red lines from the Palestinian side. Allowing the aid in, having a prisoner exchange, rebuilding Gaza, and of course having the necessary relief for the Palestinian population.